All right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone that are with us over the internet. We apologize again for the delay, but we're having some issues with our internet connection. But now we're up and running. It's always good to have all of you here on a Sunday. It's a beautiful day outside, actually, and we're all here to have another lecture by our friend Marco. He's been talking about women in the gospel, at least that's what I see here. Here. And but as always, before we start our lecture, we're going to have our initial lecture by our friend Danielle, and we're going to have our initial prayer by our friend Angela. Danny, yes.
Good morning, everyone.
Good
morning.
Today we'll be reading about the book Happy Life. Read one small page a day where you find encouragement and inspiration. Incorporate this duty into your daily habits. It will enrich you with jubilation, clearing away the clouds that could envelop you in the hours to come, and leading you to well-being in case there is some disagreeable surprise. Everyone needs a good counselor, and on this page, which you will extract from the Gospels, you will find this secure guideline and the word of wisdom for any situation. If men would just reflect a little before acting, they would avoid countless evils. Since others are not doing it, why not do it yourself?
Let's start by thanking God, our Lord, for this new opportunity for all of us to improve ourselves to be better persons. Not just for us, but for the whole world. The change starts in us. So I will ask Jesus Christ, our guide, to illuminate our speaker, Mark, to do what's need to be done for our good. So be it.
So good.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about, as you know, we just briefly discussed a little bit about women in the gospel, and then gospel according to Spiritism more specifically, and then about our society today and how we see sex and gender, and obviously some of the issues, right, that we're being encountering. It's so alive right now, right, because there's a lot of discussions about this going on in North America, but in other countries too. And I think it's a good time, right, for us to approach this topic. And obviously, full disclosure, you know, I'm a biological man and gender man talking about women, which, you know, nowadays may seem kind of interesting from a perspective that is not, you know, necessarily representing, what we're talking about. But at the same time, it also speaks to the point that maybe we should think about having more women and participating in, you know, in Spiritus Center, and being given the chance to speak to and to, you know, give lectures and be more involved. You know, even in Spiritus, we still have a primarily male-dominant circuit of speakers, right? Which is obviously something that I'm fully aware of, but at the same time, I can't change the fact it's probably this is my mission too, and I have to, you know, I have to do this, right? So, but with full disclosures, right, that I completely understand that, yeah, this should be a little bit different, but, you know, let's get started with that. Okay? All right, um, it's interesting to do a little recap of history, and if you guys see my lectures before, I try to do that. It's something I really like to do because I think we can learn a lot about what we have lived before. Because when we're talking about before Christ area, like 100 years before Christ, actually we're talking about ourselves. Lived in several incarnations ago, right? These are not different people. It's like we're talking about, oh, those guys from the past, It's like it's us, right? And the other reason I really like to read about this because I try to picture like who am I in this story, right? And I'm not kidding you. Try to do that, right? Because we have this tendency of judging whoever's in the story, right? Like we're talking about Jesus when he was being crucified and he was walking with the cross, right? And a picture of that. And if you haven't done this, please talk to me because I need to learn from you. But I can tell you, since the very first time I heard the story, I'm like, why are these people doing this? Like, are they mad? Right? They're actually throwing stones at this guy. And now I'm reading it, it's like, there am I. That's me right there. I'm probably the one that was yelling and throwing stones and poking Jesus. That's exactly what I was doing at that time. I have no doubt about it, right? So it's kind of interesting to reflect on that, right? How we've learned, right? How we're all evolving, like exactly like Kardec told us. You know what? There's one direction for us, and we should be happy about it, right? That's really what Spiritism brings to us. So before Jesus, during the Mosaic Law time, and I'm not a historian, so obviously my knowledge is limited and I'm certainly biased, but if you just look in general, like Leviticus and if you look at Deuteronomy, you find passages that I find kind of interesting to reflect on the role of women at that time, right? So obviously that was very misogynistic, right? Not only with the society, but also who was writing about it, right? It was all absolutely male-dominant societies, right? In every sense of the word. So obviously when there's a book or a textbook or scripts around about it, wrote about it, there's going to be heavily influenced by that male dominance figures, right? So for example, Leviticus 19, they're going to say, when women has a regular flow of blood, that's biology, right? The impurity, her monthly period will last 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean till the evening. Like, that's completely absurd, right? But you see how permeated in society the concept that women being less or being dirty or being some sort of evilized somehow, right? By the biology of their bodies, right? And this is crude, this is clear, right? Society accepted this as truth, right? In Deuteronomy 20, for example, they say, if, however, the charge is true and no proof of young women's, they're talking about virginity, right? Which is an interesting topic too. She shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and there the men of her town shall stone her to death. This is the scripture. This is Deuteronomy, right? She has done an outrageous thing in Israel by being promiscuous while she's still in her father's house. So this is a woman that has sexual relationship with someone, before the formal scripture and in her father's house. Basically, think about this. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they're discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels, which is money or silver, right? He must marry the wrong woman, and he has violated her, and he can never divorce her as long as he lives. But he. No one's talking about the fact that she is the one that's actually in trouble, right? All throughout this entire story. But so it's just like a little window, right, of what society saw the role of women in general at that time, right? Now you can clearly see now, and this is not too long before Christ. Like, this is a few hundred years before Christ. But if you think about Jesus coming in, right, in this society, because that's basically just still the prevalence of the ideas at that time, he would actually, we're talking about this, he would talk to them, approach them, invite them to follow. Like he would be far more acting as a quality, right, than any of this. So it was a shock, right, to the society, right? And there's obviously a major shift from this from early Christianity, as obviously women has prominent roles in the early Christianity. There was no division of who shall talk, who should not, and who should talk about the scriptures and all that. None of that existed in early Christianity, right? That was incorporated many hundreds of years later, right? When in the beginnings of the Catholic Church, right? That was most of the rules about who's supposed to do what started to appear in Christianity, right? But what's interesting, if you go back now, very, very way before that time, there were moments where even in Judaism that women had similar roles, right, to men. So it was kind of a fluctuation in that time, right? Depends on the time. So after the exile, right, the sacerdotes we're talking about, they increased the role of men progressively, right? That's when we heard those stories from. So up to a point that they couldn't, for example, learn the Torah. They would sit separately. Like all those rules started to develop more obvious and intensely, right, in Judaism. So no, Jesus, as I said, he would come to this point and completely change that approach, right? Instead of this two completely separate entities, like men and women in religion, Jesus would cure them, approach them, would interact, talk, help, ask for help. He would be completely open, right? Which again, that's a major shock to society at that time. You can just think about it, right? Someone who thinks that they would stone a woman to death for no reason, to Jesus coming and actually telling the same crowds, like, if you haven't done anything, if you haven't sinned, as the translation tells, feel free to start throwing the first rock, right? That is a shocker. But now, you only understand the shock of that moment if you really understand how it was before. Because if you're seeing with today's eyes, you're going to say, well, that's kind of obvious, right? Like, why would they do that? But that was like a complete paradigm shift, right, for what happened before. Okay. So now, another interesting things about now talking about the New Testament or the Gospels, right, that we're talking about today. There are many passages, particularly in Luke, right, that talk about women in the Gospel. And they have obviously different roles, and they're described in obviously not primary prominent roles in the Gospels, and that's kind of obvious, right? Because who's writing most of them are either the disciples themselves or someone who actually heard the story from the disciples, right? So again, it's a male-dominant society. There's a man writing about this. So in that society, and when you hear about, obviously there's a bias about who's writing it, there's obvious going to be limited roles of descriptions of women in the gospel, right? But there's some newer information about this that I'm going to bring that's interesting, right? Okay. For example, we're going to have Luke, right, in 10:38-42 is going to say. This is interesting. So Jesus is visiting, he's talking about Mary and Martha, right? So Jesus is visiting them, and then that's when the story of Lazarus too. And Mary is stopping everybody to listen, right? To stay close to Jesus, right? And Martha was like doing the chores kind of thing, right? Martha's like preparing things for the visit and kind of bringing food and that kind of stuff. So Martha is now complaining because Mary is actually not helping her, right? So Mary was actually trying to bring people to listen to Jesus while Martha is trying to set up the room. Think about this, right? And Jesus then explains that the immaterial things, right, are more important. So So what it is saying is that, so it gives a picture of what women were doing at the time. Because it's interesting because we don't think about, so we think about, oh, this is 12 men that follow Jesus, right? But we forget that that would only be possible, like you have 12 men together doing everything, like in this whole trip. Can you imagine that? Like put 12 guys together on a road trip, right? And just let them be and say, you're just gonna go. You're gonna leave everything behind. That's what Jesus tells them, right? Isn't it? You go to the fishermen's like, hey, fishermen, follow me, and you gotta leave everything behind, and we're just gonna go village to village. We're gonna preach, and that's exactly what they've done. Do you think that would ever be possible without a little bit of chaos? Now, Jesus, of course, is perfect, but the other guys, I don't think it would be possible. Just think about nowadays would be hard. Like you think about, picking 12 guys and say, yeah, you guys just go on this road trip, and you're gonna stop, no food, no money, no nothing. You're just gonna go around, and I don't think it will be really feasible. I think we'll have a lot of hard times, right, accomplishing that goal, and planning and eating and getting everything organized, and oh my goodness, yeah. So it gives a picture. This passage, if you think carefully, you're seeing that who's actually there, kind of getting things going, are actually two women, right? The men, obviously, they're probably participating too in preaching and all those things, but the whole entourage, like the whole system, is actually working because we have a picture of Mary and Martha, right, that are actually doing the important things, I would say, right, for everything to happen, right? And Jesus takes that opportunity to say, you know what, always focus on the opportunities for more improvement, because that's what Martha's trying to do, right? Martha's trying to bring people to Jesus, what he's saying, right? Instead of worrying too much about setting up the room, right? And that over the social part of it, right? The lunch and all that, right? So that's a little picture that we have on that passage, which I find interesting. So another passage that I think, another person in the gospel that is obviously, till today, poorly understood and judged and mistreated, I'd say, by the entire society, is Mary Magdalene, right? So Umberto Campos, in the book One Nova, brings a very, very nice description of this, right? And I highly recommend everyone to read about this, right? Because obviously, Mary Magdalene, she's just a normal person. Like everybody's labeled her, like, oh, she's a prostitute, she's this, she's that. I find it unbelievable, right? Like you have to have no information about this poor woman, right? And he talks about our society, right? How we judge women. Because think about this. If we have a person in this story, but like a gender or biological sex male, right? In this story, that's Jonah Magdalene, right? Or something like that. And the story was, this guy loved to party and music, and he would drink wine. He was all worried about himself and his image. And then he changed and started serving Jesus. Everybody's like, this guy, my man, this is such an amazing guy, How can he do that, right? Now you put the name Mary now. Mary loves to party, and she loved her image, and she had fun money, and she was involved in this, multiple high society gatherings, and she's a prostitute. Bingo, she's a bad person. And now she's starting to serve Jesus. Well, I don't know about that, What is she doing? I don't know. What would she do then, right? We don't hear about her, right, in the Gospels. So this is exactly what we do today. We look at this, and the first thing we do is to somehow judge Mary Magdalene, say, you know what, she's a bad person. So much so that the apostles at the time would most likely be pushing them away from Jesus. I can guarantee you that, because we have certain passages that they're completely ignored, right, on the passages, and I can tell this is about a little bit about that bias on the writing, right, for whoever's writing. Right? But we also get another glimpse of why that is not the case, is that when it really mattered most, right? When Jesus was, his body was, obviously discredited, like his body was entombed and, all that stuff. Okay, so when that was happening, who was there? Think about it. Right? Who was there? All the women, all of them. Mary, John and Cusa, right? Those are the ones that were there, checking in, doing all those things, make sure, like praying, paying respects. They were there. And the first ones that noticed that the body was not there, according to the Gospels, that again, it were them. The first people that saw Jesus in his spiritual body, them again, right? And they were like, oh, so hyped, right? The apostles, because they didn't believe it either. They're so incredibly misogynistic, right? That they're like, oh, he didn't show up to me. He didn't show up to me. It's impossible. Prove me. I think it's a great glimpse of our society, right? Because if it happened now, it would do the same thing in different terms, though, right? We wouldn't stone them, right? Something like that. But I can get, it's like even here in TSS, like it may happen. One day someone that we, don't see very often in TSS, female, comes in and is like, oh my God, guys, this happened to me. Sure, right? I'm working in TSS, I go to medium mystic, I'm all spiritualized and I have all this magic powers in my mediumship. And I didn't see that happening. I didn't see the mentor of the house. No, I didn't, because of my ego, right? Can't. But the person who cleans the floor, right, most likely to see the mentor of the house coming and blessing them, think about this hypothetical scenario, then someone, who is so worried about themselves, right, about so powerful they are, right? It can happen in street center, it can happen in churches, it can happen in work. And again, it happened in Jesus' time, exactly the same thing, right? So when Jesus was traveling, so this is another example. Picture this. So Jesus traveling through the small villages and towns and preaching. So he was not just there to talk to people about, obviously he was acting on the words that he was saying. So if you believe Jesus to obviously be perfect, that's exactly what he's doing. He's teaching by doing it, right? We all know that. So obviously when he went to these towns, if there was someone sick, his group, right, would obviously try as much as possible to take care of the people who are in need. Who is doing it? Bingo, right? Were the guys doing it? Absolutely no. Very likely no. I mean, obviously they also, in the Gospels, you notice that they're going to change dramatically many times through the times, and after Jesus discarnates, they'll actually devote themselves fully, entirely to help others, and they open up the house of the way, and they go spread the gospel. I'm not saying that they're not good people. No, that's not what I'm saying. They're phenomenal. But who's actually doing the work at the time most likely were women, right? And they're unnamed. And then we don't talk about them, right? We know Magdala did it. We had a little glimpse of it. Matthew Campbell talks about this. It's great, right? She was the one taking care of people with Hansen's disease, the one wanted to touch, right? Because they would get it. She was there, wiping their wounds. Like Paul did, right? Yeah. So, Stephen doing it, right? In the boat, right? Stephen was taking care of the captain of the boat that was actually imprisoning him, that, so this is the kind of scenario we're looking at, right? She did actually got Hansen's disease, right? By actually taking care of the people who had Hansen's disease. So just give a perspective of the critical role of women, right, during that time. Like Joanna is a great example too. Joanna de Cusa, obviously the wife of Cusa, right? So he was the manager of the house of Herodes, right, at the time. Herod Antipas, right? He was the manager. So basically, he was a servant, right, of Herod Antipas, and he was obviously the ruler of Galilee at the time, right? Herod. So Joanna was there in the house, right, in that scenario, and she was taking care of Herod because that was, kind of part of their job, right, in the household. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, she's actually named as one of the women that was cured by Jesus, right? And turned out that actually followed Jesus afterward, because she has a very important role too. Okay? She was obviously always with Jesus, and that's very clear on the Gospel. Accompanying Jesus everywhere, she would take care of all the people in need. She was the one that actually doing the work, right, when Jesus was walking around. She's a great example of what of true faith is, and we're going to hear about that in the Gospels too, but also obviously in Barnabas accounts too. Okay? So she is named in the Gospel of Luke, which obviously lists up many other women in the Gospel. Right? So Cuza was not the nicest guy, right? So he was described with some history of domestic violence and bitterness, and not actually treating Joanna very well, struggled, right? And Joanna at that time, after the cure, she was totally converted to Christianism. Well, at that time, not Christians, right? It's just to Jesus, right? At that time, but she was following Jesus, right? And that was obviously a moment of tension, right, in the household, if you think about this, right? So, when she always wanted to, after she got involved and she was cured and she was involved in the work of Jesus, she really wanted to work as hard as possible, right, in that cause, let's put it this way, right? So she had a kid with Cuza, and Cuza eventually passed away, tortured by his ideas, his hate, revenge, debts, vanities, like all of those things that still plague our society today. He ended up discarnated into the spiritual world, and she continued to work hard to raise her son, right? So she struggled very much, and this is 68 after Jesus now. Well, we all know what was happening around 60, 70 after Jesus, that, everyone that identified or was believed to be involved with Jesus was taken to the circus, right, in Rome. And that's exactly what happened to her. So she was imprisoned with her son at the time. And this is after serving Jesus through his entire passage here on earth. And then after that, continued the mission of delivering care, love to people, and the word, and practicing the words of the gospel. But now she also has a 10-year-old son, right? So on the circus, right? She also, obviously, they did this to everyone, right? They gave her a chance, right? A very nice and open-hearted, beautiful chance to deny Jesus, right? Otherwise, they're going to be burned to death, right? And obviously, she said no, right? So demonstrated her faith, but her son was with her, right? So her son says, "Please, mom, repudiate Jesus." Now think about this scenario, right? I have a hard time thinking about it. Not because I have a 10-year-old son that contributes to it, but it is like a very, very challenging scenario, right? That requires a level of moral spiritual elevation that I'm yet to do. Right? Because she was looking at the true life, which is the spiritual life. Right? Her mind was already there. She got Jesus' concept so well that she knew already in her heart that that was temporary and shall pass. Right? Even in that scenario. And even in that scenario, she understood that what was happening was the right thing to do, including for her son with God. Right? And then he continues, like, don't you see we got lost? Abjure by me, I am your son. He asks her. Then before the desperate pleas of the little boy, she recalled that Mary had also been a mother, and seeing her Jesus crucified, she was able to leave the divine laws and fulfill her mission. this is interesting because what we hear very little about the story of Mary is that after Jesus discarnates, she takes on a massive role in early Christianity, like disseminating the words of Jesus, and that's a very like with John and with the apostles. So there's a big role that she fulfills even after her amazing mission that she already had, right? And that's what she's thinking about. And she says, "Quiet, my son. Jesus was pure and did not disdain the sacrifice. Let us know how to suffer painful hour, because above all the transient happiness in this world, it is I need to be faithful to God." And then the guy, the executioner, right, asks her, "Did your Christ just teach you how to die?" And then I think this is one of the most incredible sentences that she would say, "Not only dying, but loving." That's what she tells the executioner. Now, if you're not convinced about the proof of faith of John of the Cusa, I don't think there's another way I can show you that, right? But obviously, this is the faith of pretty much everyone involved with Jesus at that time. And these are all incredibly evolved spirits, right? All of them. So, we're seeing them as fishermen, but they were not chosen by random people, right? These are spirits who were already prepared for that mission, obviously, right? And Joanna and Mary and all of the women that were part of it, critical part of it, right? And you can tell because, I was the guy throwing stones at all these people, right? And they're already saying that they love the executioner. So that's a big of a difference, right? So you can think about it, right? How morally elevated they are already at that time, right? And they continue their mission in their role, right, in the spiritual world. And obviously, the more we read about this, and if we critically look at the story, how it's written, and everyone involved, the more we start to realize and quickly realize the critical and essential participation of the women in that entire mission. Now, why am I saying this? Because now, Spiritism brings us this obviously a very clear-cut definition of this, because we are all the same. Doesn't matter. Right? We as a spirit, we're the same. I can take on a biological male body or a biological female body or any other variations of biology that are there, right? And I'm still the same person. So does it matter, right? That's the big question, right? Now it makes it easy for us to look back at this story and say, well, of course, right? So all the spirits, John and Paul and Stephen and Luke and Mark, right? All these people, and Mary, and Mary Magdalene, and all of them. Those are all spirits that are prepared. They're more elevated. They're ready for this job, and they took on different roles into that story because that's what they decided to do. But it did not matter. You can switch them around and put them in a male and female body. They would have done the same job the same way, right? So we're seeing this story with our glasses of misogyny, right, that we put on and say, oh, this is a male, this is a female. No, it's not. So if you take off your glass of misogyny and look at the story, it's like, wow, this is an amazing group of spirits, right, that came to fulfill that message that we are now trying to learn, right? So I think this is really, if you can grasp that concept, right, that we should stop seeing the story as a male versus female story, right, but rather there's an incredible group of spirits that say, you know what, yeah, we're going to follow Jesus in his incarnation, and we're going to do whatever it takes to fulfill his mission. Fine, because if one of, I'm not talking about Jesus' level of spiritual perfection, right? I'm talking about a spirit that has a little bit more morally evolved than us, comes to this planet. We today would have a hard time just believing them. Don't even think about following them or following these ideas that they bring. Right? We have so many examples, right? That's spirits that are, motivated and bring some action and love and charity to people, and society has a hard time believing they attack them, try to put them down, and we see this all the time, right? So that's why I'm telling you, they were really ready for the mission, right? Because if it was like me, they pick to say, follow Jesus and leave all your nets behind, like, hell out of here. No, like, they go, get out, you're crazy. Go walk. I don't want to talk to you, Get out of my fishing area, like you're bothering my fish, That's what I would say. I can guarantee you that, right? So, just give us that window, right? So for example, I was talking about Mary, right? Mary, like the mother of Jesus, Mary, right? So after the discarnation, she goes back to family to Bethany and gets involved with early Christians at the time. Obviously, she was like an enormous amount of good vibration and knowledge and understanding of Jesus. Of course, she actually cared for him. Like this is the incarnation. So John returns, and John and Mary decide that they'll take particular areas or roles, right, in that time. And she ended up going to Ephesus, right, to continue the mission of Jesus there. While John obviously would go and spread the word in other areas. So she would, this is all about the campus. She would care for the sick, the poor, the suffering, like exactly what Jesus was doing, basically, right? The part that we don't hear very much described in the Gospels, right? But obviously, if we know him and we know the story, then that's what was happening, right? Okay. So why is it important? Why are we talking about this? Because, this is, I'm just trying to show you that, from the Old Testament to here, we're still dealing with similar scenarios in our society, right? So for example, sex, gender inequality, right? What is this, right? Obviously, it's a phenomenon where people are not treated the same according to either their gender, which is like a socially derived concept, it's like how people present themselves, or sex, like biological sex. But it also could be psychology, could be cultural norms, right? The way someone dresses, the way someone presents themselves, or the way looks, right? All of this is, if people are not treated, if people are treated differently because of that, either biologically or socially derived concepts, or because of any of those features, that is the type of inequality we're looking at, and this is very alive and in our society still today, right? Now, how do we know that? There's lots of studies on this, right? If we say that, I didn't know that, right? We hear this all the time, right? Because we're maybe looking at very small social circles that we participate, that we see equally number of men and women, let's say, let's just start this way in a group, right? And I'm not even talking about the different genders, which makes it even more complicated, right? Because still, it makes it even harder for them to be accepted, to be included, to be part of society. So there are clear differences in life expectancy, education, salary, pretty much every single metric in our studies have pointed out to differences, what we call gender inequality in our society nowadays. Right? It also is going to affect even more non-binary people, right? That is even like another level of inequality in our society. We've just been through like a pandemic, like for 3 years, and that made everything worse, right? Because what the pandemic did is like heightened or highlighted the inequalities that already existed, right? And made it even harder for people, right? All sorts of discrimination showed up that was kind of hidden in the background, and we see movements that are primarily discriminatory or against marginalized groups, right? Immigrants, people with disabilities, like extreme poverty. We saw how vaccines were rolled out according to to the access to vaccines were different across the world. So certain countries and groups would die a lot more, right? Because they didn't have access to treatments. So that was made it worse basically to all of us, right? Things that we didn't talk about much, and now it's coming up. For example, the higher incidence of intimate partner violence that occurred during the pandemic, right? That again, this is something that still exists, right? Remember the story we talked about, Deuteronomy? They're saying, you know what? If the woman did this, like that stoned her, right? She did this, she did that, whatever. The reason they find for it, right? They're like, yeah, attack, violate her body, Well, we're kind of still doing it. Like intimate partner violence in some countries is actually one of the highest percentages of women violence, right? And it's still happening. And because people are isolated in their homes, obviously the risk of it increased quite significantly, right? So all the community structures that were available to protect women and girls, obviously they were paralyzed because of the pandemic, made it hard, right? So, just to show you that things are a little bit worse now than they were 3 years ago, right? Now, we have data for that, and there's tons of studies, as I said. I'll just bring you, for example, a summary from the Canadian Women's Foundation, right? In Canada, women earn 28% on average, right? In some professions, it's actually worse. 28% less than men, and the gap is actually getting worse, not smaller. It's widening, right? For the same job, same position, right? So, but at the same time, if you look at Canadian universities, for example, they're actually better educated than men. So more than half of Canadian grads are women, more than half. And there's more like postgraduate now women in medicine is a great example, right? In dentistry, for example, like where I teach, right? So our classes now are predominantly women, right? They're graduating. But if you look at other, for example, if you look at CEOs and board of directors, for example, like CEOs of big companies, 5% of women. So they graduate more from university, they get more postgraduate training, and they represent only 5% of the hierarchy in companies. Why is that? That's a great clear-cut example of inequality, right? How they are treated differently, right? From the top paid jobs in Canada, only 8% are women, right? So 21% of single moms are raising kids in under poverty line in Canada. I always think it doesn't exist. It does. It's out there. Just kind of masqueraded by social programs that kind of keep things kind of going, but it exists, right? Compared to 9% of the rest of the Canadian population, right? 50%, and this is in Canada, 50% of women in Canada above the age of 18 have experienced some sort of sexual or physical assault. 50. Okay. Again, that's the stoning heritage that we're carrying. It's not different. It just changed the context, right? Instead of stoning, I'm going to harass them, right? Or treat them differently, or people feel that they have the right to say things or do things and touch them or whatever, right? So this is kind of the same parallel I'm trying to bring, right? Because we're the same spirits doing it, right? So we need to change, right? That's what I'm trying to say. We're running out of time, right? We got to do this, right? Because plan-test transition is coming. If you believe that things are really dramatically going to change soon, and they may, is that we got to act up, right? Otherwise, we're going to be on hold, right? For in our class year, right? We're kind of grade 2 or grade 1 maybe or kindergarten of spiritual evolution. So we're gonna be holding a little extra year. Okay. So Spirit's book, chapter 8, part 3, question 817. Are men and women equal before God, and do they have the same rights? And the answer is, Hasn't God given them both the intelligence, knowledge of good and evil for the faculties to progress? So that's the Spirit's answer with another question, which I find interesting. Like, come on, don't ask me this question. Like, this is like 1850, right? And now we're like 2023, and it's like, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. So where does the moral inferiority of women in certain regions come from? You see, that's kind of the regional understanding that women are less than men, right? From the unjust and cruel domination that men have exerted over them, it is a result of social institutions, and the abuse of strength over weakness is exactly the same feeling. Among men who have not advanced very much from the moral point of view, might makes right. So again, if you take away the fact now that the spirits are the same, right? We as spirits can inherit, can use any body. So, it's really time for us to start thinking more about this, right? I think, we can, there's many other questions. So the Spirits Book, chapter 8, is like a sequence of questions about of men and women, right? And I encourage you to read about it, question 8, 10, 17, 27. I encourage you to read about it. It gives a nice, interesting perspective on this. But most importantly, the fact that we as spirits, we don't have a sex or a gender, right? So we can manifest ourselves the way we decide to, right? We can, when we're incarnated, we can use either biological male or female bodies, and that really depends on what's the role I have in that particular incarnation, right? And, and we should really, I think what Spirit is bringing, I think what I try to do every day, or I think what we should try to do every day, is really start seeing things as such a polarized binary world, right? So in other words, it's either that or this. Like we do that reduction analysis, that we call it reduction data analysis, because it makes it easier for statistics, right? So remember we're a researcher, right? If you group it in two groups, it's a lot easier to analyze, right? It's either that or this, right? So I think our brain thinks that way a little bit. If you think about our spirit's connection to our brain, it makes it a lot easier for us to understand whether it's yes or no. But the shades between it makes it a lot more complicated to analyze. But reality is that nothing's really this or that, like in any field of science, right? And I think if we make an effort to see how we've been doing for like several thousands of years on this planet, right? And how should we actually stop actively thinking how to change the way we see this, right? Not in this binary world of things, and consider that there's a spectrum of everything, right? And accept it and respect it, right? And basically go back to the principle and say, well, we should treat everybody the same, to respect everybody, love everybody, and and start from that point of view. It will make it a lot easier for us to move on, right? Because what I'm really hoping is that, maybe in 4023, right, 2,000 years from now, we're going to come here, we don't have to read this again, right? Because think about it, how many times we're reading this? Like the same concepts, right? Now we're still debating and talking, and we see some spirits out there incarnated today that really cannot get this, right? They're right doing the opposite of it. They want to make it harder. They want to make it more discriminatory, and and we see this now. It shocks us. Good. It shows that we're changing, right? Because when we see it now, and it shocks us, because before we were stoning people, and we're like, yeah, go for it, right? Now we're seeing someone, marginalized or discriminating against someone. We're like, oh, this is kind of not cool, right? So that tells us we're kind of moving, right? But hopefully, all of us will move to a point that we don't have to even debate this stuff, right? It's like, okay, this is basic principle, done, right? So that's what I really hope we can achieve, and spirituals can help with that. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for this nice conversation.
Thank you, Marco, for a great lecture. You're talking about this, and I was remember in the beginning when talking about women in the gospel. It's just reading a book, and he talks about even another moment where the women were present when Jesus was being crucified.
Yeah.
And the book was saying, where was the people, where were all the people that Jesus cured?
Yeah.
Because can you imagine,
Yes.
like, all the work that he did, those people should be there to support him, and none of them show up, and except for John,
Yeah.
the rest was the women.
Yes, exactly. Everyone was in it. Yes.
Yes,
John
except
was
for
the only
John,
one, yeah.
was the only man.
Yeah.
Besides, there's only the women there. Where were even the apostles? Where were the other 11, right? Where was all the men that he cured, all the, the things that at the time were called miracles, right? There was the women that were there with him, and then his mother, and all the other women were there present to him, right? And even Joanna de Cruzes from Paraguay is mentalizing him and speaks with him, right? So I don't say anything, but currently we have some advantage.
Yes,
I'm
100%.
not biased.
I agree with that.
Full disclosure, I'm not biased.
I was throwing the stone at the time, so I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Do you have any comments or questions on the internet? Do you have any comments or questions here?
Yeah.
So, one of the arguments that people used to say for the reason why the Bible is true is exactly because of this. So when the tomb was open, the people that saw it first were the woman. And if you're making a story up at that time, putting the woman as the witness would actually describe your story.
Yeah.
So the fact that they actually put it showed that they were actually telling the truth, right?
Yeah.
Because if they were making stuff up, they would just put a man.
Yes,
Yes.
that's right.
Yeah.
That would actually, yeah, absolutely. That makes total sense, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I really have time. I'm here earlier than I keep reading, and but it's just talking about exactly this, how the women are present and how they're important. And it's probably one of the most faithful followers in Jesus' name.
Exactly.
Right? But put it down because of society at the time. So that's what we're talking. And of course, the Gospels were written by the apostles, were men who probably like tone it down the amount of talking about them, right? So they're mentioned, so we know about
They're
them.
unnamed, most of them, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
just by the first name,
Yes.
or like Joanna of Cusa, which is the man, right?
Exactly.
Whereas, there's always this bias, right, in how they're reported, and, yeah. But this is normal for society, like, I'm trying to say this, but I'm not judging them, right? I'm just saying that this is exactly what we expected at that time. There's nothing wrong with that, in a way that I'm not, saying bad things about them, right? But, I think it's time for us to move on to that. So.
And another aspect that you brought that to me is very important is when you're talking about how notice at the time called fishermen and they left everything and went, and today we wouldn't do that, right, most of us. But we always being called, and Emmanuel talks about this, we always being called by Jesus. And sometimes not just to drop everything, though. Sometimes just, hey, it's time to wake up, right? Is there all the things that we put aside? Oh, I know I should study a little bit more. Oh, but I don't have the time. We always being called to read more or to come to participate on a study group that, I never have a time, but I know I should do it. We're constantly being called by him, right? But we constantly, and he's not asking anyone here to drop everything and go. He's asking in small things, but we keep postponing, right? And we should be careful because we constantly being called by him. And or even to just do a little act of goodness to people around us, right? So maybe we should be a little more aware of his calls for us and say, I'm here, I'll go. Small things, right? Not big things. Because I'm not dropping everything going on. Yeah. All right. So thank you, Marco. Thank you everyone that was with us over the internet. We're hoping to see you back with us next weekend here.